Welcome to this webinar organized by the History and Political Economy of Business and Finance cluster. I am Daniele Tori and I'm a lecturer in finance at the Open University Business School, and I am a member of the HYPE cluster. It's great to see so many people at the end of what I'm sure has been a busy day for everyone. And for those of you attending one of our events for the first time, let me just briefly say that HYPE brings together scholars who aim at developing a critical approach to business and financial theory. And the cluster puts forward an interdisciplinary research agenda using insights from the perspective of political economy and history. We have a web page, in case you're interested, in which you can find information about our research and also the recordings of our past events. So today we are excited to introduce our speaker for this event, who found the time to join us within a very busy schedule, I'm sure. So first, let me thank Francesco for his time. So Professor Saraceno is Deputy Department Director at OFC Sciences Po, where he teaches international and European macroeconomics within the Master in European Affairs. He is also Academic Director of the Sciences Po Northwestern European Affairs Program and member of the Scientific Board for the Lewis School of European Political Economy in Rome. He holds PhDs in economics from Columbia University and La Sapienza University of Rome. And his main research interests include the relationship between inequality and macroeconomic performance, European macroeconomic policies, and the interaction between structural reforms and fiscal and monetary policies. And this research has been published in several journals, and also Francesco has several books published on European macroeconomics and policy. He is also very active in advising policymakers and international organizations. In 2000s, he became a member of the Council of Economic Advisors for the Italian Prime Minister's office, and he regularly does consulting and executive training, and is also involved in the dialogue of macroeconomic policies within the International Labour Organization. So, and for those of you that are active on social media, Francesco maintains a blog on European matters, and he regularly intervenes in the public debate on the European economy. And also you can find him on Twitter as well. So today, Francesco will give a talk titled Europe at the Crossroads, the EMU between crisis and the debates on reform. So Francesco will talk for about 45 minutes, and then after this we will have let's say
50.
Okay, let's say 50. Thanks. Or 55 if you want, no problem. It's just for organizational matters. But then, yeah, we will have a Q&A after this. Please, may I remind you to switch off your microphone and camera. And if you want, you can start posting your question in the chat box, and I will keep an eye on that so that we can organize the Q&A later. So again, thanks a lot, everyone, for coming today. And thank you again, Francesco, for your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to share with you my thoughts on Europe. Oh, hold on, you disappeared. Okay. Something went wrong. I'm not sharing anymore, right?
Daniele.
I can see your slides.
You can see my slides?
Yeah.
Are they full screen now?
Yes, they are.
Okay, perfect. Sorry. As you were saying, I will try to give you my thoughts on this very difficult moment for Europe. It's a difficult and at the same time exciting, because it's a moment of change. And for the first time, I mean, it's hard to say this in these days where we have a war at the border of the European Union, but it's for the first time in the past 10 to 15 years, I am being a bit optimistic about future developments in Europe, in the sense that I think that what the global financial crisis couldn't do, so force Europe to rethink itself, the COVID crisis managed to do. And so I always say to my students that if I had to give the same talk I'm giving today 2 years ago, 3 years ago, before the beginning of the pandemics, I would have ended on a very gloomy note by saying that Europe was basically heading against a wall. And now I have a more mixed picture, and I think that there are some important developments that are happening. And so this short period we spent together in the next hour and a half, I will try to detail my views about the recent developments. And so, in some sense, even if I took it away from the title of the PowerPoint, the title "Europe at a Crossroads" is, in my opinion, quite appropriate. So this is what I'm going to do. First of all, I will try to set myself. You don't know me, so you don't know where I come from and where I'm going, and so it's important that I explain you what is my overall stance in Europe, and I will try to argue that in the past 10 years, people who think like me have been quite lonely in the European debate because they were crushed and they were squeezed between two different but somewhat converging views on Europe. On one side, the Eurosceptics, and on the others, those who thought that everything was going very well and there was no need to reform Europe at all. For the Italians, if there are Italians in the room, this reformist loneliness is the title of a wonderful essay by Federico Caffè, so I just stole it from him. Then I will explain why I do believe that you need to reform Europe, and most notably the Euro, so the Eurozone, and I will try to argue that the Euro was ill-conceived in some sense. It was built on the wrong premises, and so all the problems we had were kind of built in from the very beginning. At the same time, I will also argue that there is nothing intrinsically wrong with the single currency. It's just the way it was built that is wrong, and so a different euro can actually be built and be functional. So there is no need to break everything just because the current configuration of the euro is not satisfying. And then I will quickly go over the developments of the euro, ill-conceived, and what happened. I will, in the end, conclude that if we are still here, it's not thanks to the European policymakers, or at least it's thanks to one particular policymaker, which is not, of course, the person, but it's the institution, which is the ECB. The euro has been saved by the ECB and certainly not by the European governments or the European institutions. And then I will, so that I would have stopped a few years ago and say that everything was looking very gloomy. And as I said before, since 2020, my take on Europe has changed quite a bit, because Europe proved to be quick and effective in managing the most, I would say, momentous crisis that we had in a few generations. And so this sudden reactivity of Europe is a quite good entry point to the debate on EMU reform, on which I will spend the end of my presentation. So this is more or less the line of thought that I will be following. And as we agreed before, if you have clarification questions, please do not hesitate to unmute yourself or to go through the organizers. This is whatever you do, but I mean, don't hesitate to interrupt me if you have clarification questions. If you have comments or questions that go beyond what I will say, there is a Q&A time towards the end, so we can use that for this type of questions. So, as I said before, there's been a sort of monopoly of the debate. On one side, the Eurosceptics; on the other, those who I call the Euro fanatics. And these two groups have very different, of course, political platforms. The former say that we should go back to national countries because the euro cannot work. And the latter, the Euro fanatics, say that basically the euro is perfectly fine as it is, and we just need to fine-tune it a little bit. What I found fascinating from the very beginning of the euro, from the early years 2000, is that these two opposite political platforms had the same starting point, the same premise. Okay, they both the Eurosceptics and the Euro fanatics say that the euro is intrinsically neoliberal and cannot be anything but neoliberal. And so then of course, the former said, then we need to get out of it because it cannot work, and the other said it's perfectly fine. We should just make sure that we fit better with the political prescriptions of the neoliberal theory, and so we double our reform effort. This sort of convergence of these very two different political projects into a same premise, of course, made the Eurosceptic side of the debate gave the upper hand to the Eurosceptic side of the debate, because if you have a construction, a single currency that is like that cannot be anything but what you see at work, and if what you see at work is leading to multiple crises, from the Greek crisis to the austerity programs, etc., well, if it's either that or nothing, well, it's easy to say that it's better to have nothing. And so the Eurosceptics, for a long period, actually had the upper hand, and in some sense, they also won some political battles. They briefly ruled in Italy, for example. They did quite well in the French election, even if they didn't get to power. They somehow also affected the Brexit debate, of course, and they had an important thing in the Brexit debate. So the challenge to the premise that the euro is intrinsically neoliberal is, for me, crucial if you want to have a reform-minded stance. If you believe that the European project is potentially the best course of action for European countries, so find a way to work together and to be together is the best way for Europe to be in today's world, then it's important that we break this sort of identity between euro and neoliberalism, because if we don't break that identity, then of course we cannot make the point that Europe can work better than it worked in the past. And so in some sense, that has been for the past 20 years, I would say, since I've been working on Europe, which basically is since the euro was created. That doesn't make me any younger. This has been my project, finding ways to propose institutional adjustments to make the euro work better. And this has led me in the past to be, not just me, but many people who have the same mindset, to be in a sort of difficult position, because on one side we were criticized by the euro fanatics because we were too critical of the euro. On the other, we were criticized by the Eurosceptics because they believe that our critical stance should have led us to reject the European project. And so that is why people like me have been quite lonely in the debate in the past. Okay, so let me first ask one question: is the euro neoliberal today? And the answer is yes. There is no doubt that the euro is a neoliberal construction. There is a very strong emphasis in the European institutional setting on markets as the main force behind both the long-term growth and the capacity to absorb shocks and to make different regions converge. So markets are at the center of the picture, and these markets are believed to be efficient, or at least more efficient than governments. And that emphasis shows in the European institutions. I mean, there is a typo here, sorry. The European institutions that reflect that emphasis on market and basically leave very little space to governments. So we have, as you may know, the criteria for entering into the euro that were set in the Maastricht Treaty, the 5 criteria on debt, deficit, inflation, exchange rate, and interest rates, that are all nominal criteria. The idea being that if governments manage to provide markets with a stable nominal environment, so stable inflation interest rates, stable exchange rates, public finances that are under control, then it's the job of markets to ensure that there is also real convergence, and so convergence of unemployment rates, convergence of growth rates, and so on and so forth. There is nothing governments can do to make sure that the real variables converge. They can only provide a stable nominal environment, and hence the European macroeconomic policy institutions are very strongly constrained. On one side, fiscal policy, which is in the hand of governments, is constrained by the Stability and Growth Pact, that is basically a fiscal rule that rules out any discretion and leave only automatic stabilization at work. And on the other, monetary policy is quite restrictive in the sense that the ECB has a very strict inflation targeting mandate, and it's very much independent in pursuing it, and so it is a quite peculiar institution among central banks. Last but not least, the only industrial policy that Europe allowed, I would say, but allows, the current rules allow, is competition policy. The idea that the job of industrial policy of governments should be to make sure that the playing field is leveled, and so that there is no unfair advantage for any firm and or sector, and then you have that markets pick the winners and select the most productive use of resources, and so they allocate resources towards economic growth. And so once again, there is no role for the government in pursuing long-term growth. And so the bottom line is that the only job of governments is a job to make sure that the markets can work as smoothly as possible, and this is what structural reforms are for. So there is very little doubt that this whole setup, this whole institutional construction is neoliberal in nature. The point is, and that will be my whole point for the rest of today's talk, is that it does not need to be, and this is where I'm very strongly in disagreement. For example, from the Eurosceptics in my country, or in the country where I live, which is France, and there is no intrinsic reason why the euro should be as it has been built. Let me try to first of all set the stage for this claim. There is I mean, you know that the debate on, you may know, I don't know if you do know, the debate on the euro has been framed in the 70s, 80s, and eventually in the 90s within the theory of optimal currency areas, which is an old theory that dates back from the 1960s and is due to Robert Mundell, who incidentally won the Nobel Prize, was given the Nobel Prize in 1999 in recognition of the role, among other things, in the recognition of the role that his theory had in framing the discussion on the euro. And the theory of optimal currency areas asks a very simple question. So when is it optimal, and when is it optimal? What are the conditions that make it optimal to abandon the own currency of a country and to join a monetary union? As you can imagine, we economists are quite trivial people. Mundell said answered this question in a typical cost and benefit analysis. And the idea of Mundell is that if you join a currency union, you lose a tool for absorbing shocks that hit your country. That's what we call asymmetric shocks. And this tool that you lose is, of course, monetary policy that is transferred to the federal institution called the Federal Central Bank. And of course, that may be a problem or may not be a problem. It is not a problem, for example, if markets are very flexible. So if markets can adjust to shocks, then of course you have people moving, factors of production moving from country to country, you have wages and and prices adjusting. You have capital movements, credit markets that smooth these fluctuations through lending from excess savers to excess consumers. And so there is a set of what we call market risk sharing mechanisms that allow countries hit by asymmetric shocks not to explode, but to actually reconverge towards the center. But this is not the only criterion that you have in the optimal currency areas. You have another criterion which is based on government risk sharing. So the idea that through a federal government budget you can transfer funds from regions going well to regions going less well, and that cools down the regions that are going well and boosts the regions that are going less well, and so absorbs the asymmetric shock. So you can have risk sharing by market, you can have risk sharing by governments. Okay, in Europe, the choice was made to close down completely this government risk-sharing channel that doesn't exist in the current European institution, and to only rely on the first one, on market adjustment. And so it was the choice of policymakers to make the euro neoliberal, but nothing in the theory of optimal currency areas led to that conclusion. It was a choice that was made by the architects of the euro. This is something that I insist a lot, even with my students, because it's a big misconception. Lots of people say the Mandel theory is neoliberal. No, it's the Mandel theory as it was applied in the construction of European institutions that is neoliberal, not the theory per se. Actually, Mandel is considered to be a Keynesian, if you want, in this long-lasting and not very interesting juxtaposition between Keynesian and neoliberal or neoclassical economies. Mandel is more on the side of the Keynesians than on the side of neoclassical economies. So what made that choice possible is the intellectual environment, what we can call the mainstream, that was dominant at the time of the construction of the euro between the late 80s and the early 90s. And what was that consensus? That consensus was a sort of revised version of the old neoclassical theory, pre-Keynesian neoclassical theory, that is built on the idea, as I said before, that markets are optimal. They are capable of converging by themselves to the natural equilibrium of the economy, so they don't need any help in converging to the natural equilibrium of the economy, and that the only job of governments is to try to make this convergence as fast as possible and to make the natural equilibrium as optimal as possible, as welfare enhancing as possible. And once again, that is the job of structural reforms. Structural reforms clear the way from rigidities that may make the natural equilibrium diverge from the optimal equilibrium, and structural reforms also clear the way from obstacles that can prevent markets from converging to the natural equilibrium. And so if you live in that type of world, then of course you don't have to apply any macroeconomic policy, to implement any discretionary macroeconomic policy, because you don't need it, because markets go by themselves to the equilibrium, and actually you risk by implementing discretionary policies to actually perturb market, to give the wrong signals to markets that cannot quickly converge to the equilibrium. So the best course of action is to actually follow rules, be them fiscal rules or macroeconomic rules. Those who are old enough, I don't think there are many of you who are old enough to remember the debate in macroeconomics of the late 90s, early years 2000, might remember that 80% of the academic papers of the time on fiscal and monetary policy were papers dealing in some way or another with the best way to build a rule to constrain fiscal and monetary policy. There was no doubt that rules should be built. It was just a question of asking what was the optimal rule. Okay, so that was the world in which the architect of the euro studied. went to school and then went on ministries and European institutions and drafted the treaty. So it's not surprising that if they had been taught these things, then they put these things into the European institutions. Okay. And so that is why the euro was born neoliberal, not because it needed to be born neoliberal, simply because it reflected l'esprit du temps, as they say here in France, the spirit of the time. That was the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is to try to trace a little bit the story of the euro from the 90s to the, let's say, to the end of the sovereign debt crisis. And we can clearly see that there are two phases in that period. The first phase is the one that starts, I put there 1999 because it's the date of birth of the euro, but we could actually go a little bit back in time and put 92, 93, so the beginning of the convergence process that was put in motion by the Maastricht Treaty of 1992. This doesn't change much. Okay, so you have a long period, 10 to 15 years, in which the countries of the so-called periphery, so it's the countries that were poorer, that had lower income per capita, Greece, of course, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, tended to grow faster. And that is something that is one of the very few non-controversial results in growth theory, is that the countries that tend to grow faster when they have lower levels of income per capita and capital per capita. So that period saw, in fact, the countries of the periphery grow faster, and they finance their growth and investment with savings coming from core countries. So there was a sort of transfer of resources, a flow of capital from the core countries that were mature countries, not growing too much and saving a lot, towards the countries of the periphery that finance the growth of the latter. And of course, that created some imbalances, because you had countries in the core that were running current account surpluses and countries in the so-called periphery that were running current account deficits. And these and these kind of compensated each other, and so the countries in the periphery had a sort of excess demand, lots of capital and consumption investment, and the countries in the core had an excess of savings that were financing the excess demand of the core. And these imbalances were seen at the time as a natural side effect of this convergence process and some sort of benign imbalances, in the sense that the idea was, okay, yes, the countries of the periphery are increasingly indebted, but this debt will be paid because as they are growing very fast, the future growth will eventually allow them to repay their debt, so that debt is sustainable. It's simply the natural effect of the convergence. Well, think again. And now we know ex post, I mean, some people knew it already at the time, but I mean, certainly we know it now, is that this debt was all but benign, and that the capital flows from the core to the periphery were much larger than simply the excess savings. There was a sort of overblown financial sector that was channeling resources towards the core, towards the periphery of the Eurozone. And the euro, by the way, the Eurozone was a sort of fractal, a smaller scale version of the same type of capital flows that were flowing from savers at the world level, East Asian countries, Middle East countries, and Eurozone core towards the deficit countries like the United States. So Europe was a small scale, if you want, version of the imbalances that were building on in the rest of the world economy. And in the Eurozone, as much as in the rest of the world, these capital flows did not go and finance productive investment, but on the contrary, they went to finance non-produced assets. These are the years, for example, as you may remember, when we had a large housing bubble, and before the housing bubble, in the late 90s, we had the ICT bubble. Okay, so you had an increase in foreign debt, you had an increase in debt that was the side product of these capital flows that did not lead to an increase of assets. And so you had an increasing financial fragility. I repeat, think of Europe as a small-scale version of what was happening at the world level. I think if you are interested in these topics, I mean, I will not go much more in detail here. If you're interested in these topics, I strongly suggest that you read the book by Adam Tooze, Crash. It's that thick, but it's actually explaining these things quite well. And it's also quite, I mean, I think he would share my idea that Europe was simply a small-scale version of the imbalances that we're building on the rest of the world. And then, as always happens when you have these type of phenomena of speculative capital flows that build up imbalances, that eventually these imbalances come up to the surface, and you can have any trigger to the crisis. Any episode can be a trigger to the crisis. In the case of the global financial crisis, it was the subprime markets that went wrong. In the case of the Eurozone crisis, it was the revelation of Greek frauds in the public finances figures that were reported to Eurostat. But whatever the trigger was, that was a very typical and very well known by us economists. I mean, I'm speaking to a finance group, so you know these things better than me. It was a typical case of a sudden stop. So the capital flows suddenly reversed, and the periphery went into a solvency crisis. Okay. The interesting thing, I think, of the Eurozone crisis it becomes a specific crisis. Okay? The global financial crisis was global by definition, and it was not born in Europe. It was born, as you all know, in the financial sector of the United States. Okay, so it was a crisis that was Keynesian in nature, excessive debt, that was created and caused by a number of issues that, I mean, it's not the time here, I don't have the time here, increasing inequality, bubbles, financial deregulation, all of these things led to excessive debt. And then once the trigger of the subprime market was triggered, that led to a deleveraging process, tried to a drop in consumption and investment, and eventually to an aggregate demand crisis. And this typical aggregate demand crisis was met with a typical and a quite effective policy reaction, textbook policy reaction. I mean, it's a policy reaction you could understand by using an ISLM model. Monetary policy on one side injected liquidity in the system to avoid that the financial market collapse, and fiscal policy took the stand, took the place of the missing private demand, and sustain economic activity through fiscal stimulus. And that worked quite well. The recession was very sharp, but very short-lived. In just a few months, you could see some signs of recovery. Lehman is October 2008, and the first signs of a recovery of investment and consumption are already in the third quarter, I would say, of 2009. So just a few months, considering the scale of the crisis, that was a quite remarkable performance of policy makers. But then in October 2009, we have the episode of the Greek elections when Papandreou takes office, and a month later he calls Merkel, Sarkozy, and Barroso, respectively, German Chancellor, French President, and President of the Commission, and he says, listen, we cheated, it's in a bipartisan way, all the previous governments cheated, both the left and the right government cheated in our debt and deficit statistics. We are in much worse shape than we led you to believe, and more importantly, market noticed that, and now that that money has become scarce because of the global financial crisis, nobody is ready to refinance us. And that revelation of frauds triggers a quite important change of narrative. Okay, so a crisis that was born in the private sector in the European second round version that starts in 2009, becomes a sovereign debt crisis. Government that had been the solution to the global financial crisis between 2007 and 2009 now becomes the problem. And so there is this narrative leads to what I called in many things I wrote in the past, the Berlin view, that says the crisis is the result of the responsible behavior of fiscal profligacy of a few countries that did not do their homework, and these countries have now need to put their house in order. They have to do their homework. That is a quote that I think she regretted afterwards by Angela Merkel. They should, on one side, make their economy more competitive, and so finally implement reforms of the pension system, of the labor market, and so on and so forth. And on the other, they should implement fiscal consolidation plans, or you can call them austerity plans, whatever expression you prefer. It amounts at the same thing. And so this combo, this sort of joint structural reforms plus austerity menu was applied to all the countries in the periphery and was also followed by the countries of the core. Was the public debt the problem? Well, no. This is a figure that shows on the y-axis public debt, on the x-axis a government deficit. And as you can see, I have created 4 quadrants using the Maastricht criteria, 3% deficit and 60% deficit. Okay, so what you have is that countries here are countries that are perfectly fine. Countries here have excessive debt, but they're fine in terms of flows, in terms of the government deficit. Countries here are the countries that do not fulfill the criteria on both accounts. I took 2007, so before the global financial crisis, so before governments needed to step in and save the economy from the collapse of the financial sector. And I've highlighted the countries in crisis, the so-called profligate countries, the countries that were supposed to have excessive government debt. Before the global financial crisis, the only country that actually fits with the Berlin view narrative is Greece. Greece had excessive debt and deficit. That is something that is beyond doubt. Portugal was basically very similar to a country like France, so around more or less around the Maastricht criteria targets. Italy had a specific and long-lasting history of public finances misconduct and mismanagement, and so it had a legacy of very high debt, but with a quite disciplined country. If you look at the yearly flows to a deficit, actually not many people know, but in all over the lifespan of the euro, so since 1999, there is only one country that ran better primary balances than Italy, that is Germany. So Italy is the second most disciplined country in Europe, except that it has very large deficits because it has a very large debt legacy, and so it has to pay interest on its debt. But if you look at primary balances, Italy does better than any other Eurozone country, with the exception of Germany. And then you had 2 countries, Ireland and Spain, that were actually the poster boys of the Commission and of the IMF, because they coupled very healthy public finances. You can see very low levels of debt and zero or even negative deficits, so actually a surplus in terms of flows of budget balance. At the same time, we had very strong growth, and so the IMF and the Commission would point these 2 countries as role model for the other European countries, including, ironically, Germany. So we don't see a pattern here. Okay, we see that the countries in crisis had, in terms of public finances, very diverse situations. Where we see a pattern is in the external imbalances that are here I capture with the difference between domestic consumption and domestic demand and domestic production. All the countries of the so-called periphery had a look at the red bars, sorry, it's 2007, had at the dawn of the crisis very strong current account deficits, so they were accumulating foreign debt, and all the countries of the so-called core had excess savings. Notice that in 2007, these imbalances kind of compensated each other, so the Eurozone as a whole was in equilibrium. It did not dump its excess production to the rest of the world, and it did not absorb production from the rest of the world. It was more or less in balance. If you now look at the yellow bars, you will see the impact of what I call the Berlin view policies. The countries of the so-called periphery did adjust following the crisis. Most of these countries eliminated their excess demand, mostly because, with the exception of Spain, that is mostly because these countries went into recession. When you go into recession, of course, you cut consumption, including imports, and so your external imbalances vanish, and they turn into net savers. On the other hand, you can see that this adjustment was not symmetric, because the countries that were spending too little, so they had excess savings, actually increased, especially the two largest ones, the Netherlands and Germany, increased their excess savings, and they increased their current account surplus. And I took 2015 because this is when Mario Draghi, I will come to that in a moment, stepped in with the QE program. And so Europe as a whole, the Eurozone as a whole, went from balance to net savings, to a positive current account. Basically, it's what I called sometimes the Germanization of the Eurozone. Europe started growing only thanks to its exports to the rest of the world. And so from being neutral with respect to the rest of the world, it became a factor of global imbalances. I mean, this is 2015 is when the Obama administration issued a very nasty document blaming Germany for dumping their excess production to the rest of the world, so for being a deflationary force on the world economy. And then Donald Trump came after that. I mean, with let's say, with a different style, he said the same thing, and he blamed Germany and Europe for not being cooperative with the rest of the world. Okay, that was the Berlin view at work. Austerity and structural reforms imposed to peripheral countries and followed by core countries, because this myth of the compression of domestic demand and of export-led growth was, of course, an objective per se, that led to the procyclical fiscal policies and eventually to a second EMU recession between the end of 2012 and the beginning of 2013. That recession is a privilege that Europe has alone. And while the first global financial crisis hit all of the world economy, the recession of 2013 is a privilege that Europe had by itself. And this is when we were saved by Mr. Mario Draghi, and of course, Mr. Mario Draghi as the representative of the ECB, first with the whatever it takes, and that was followed by the OMT. Basically, the central bank said, no way that we will let a country go under because of speculation. So if countries are under attack by financial markets, the ECB will step in and buy all the bonds necessary to avoid default. And then, of course, with quantitative easing that, even if much later than in the UK or in the US, eventually also was implemented in Europe and helped keep the interest rate of peripheral countries low, and so to give them some fiscal space. But at the time, already at the time, Mario Draghi and all the ECB officials speaking on these matters said, we can make your life easier, we can avoid speculation, we can shield you from market pressure, we cannot restart the economy. The economy is in a liquidity trap, and so whatever whatever expansionary fiscal policy we implement, it will never be able to restart the economy. To do that, you need fiscal policy. On top of that, of course, you may have different needs in different European countries, and so we cannot use the single monetary policy, the unique monetary policy, to deal with the problem of all the other countries. So from that very moment, the ECB said, we are saving you, but we cannot solve the problems. For that, we need fiscal policy. And of course, nobody listened, and fiscal policy remained basically at best neutral, if not contractionary, all the way into 2019. While Europe was stubbornly working, keeping these sort of old recipes of getting the government out of the way, these old neoliberal recipes that were, by the way, also fitting with its institution, in the rest of the world was changing. And so it was the most exciting moment to be a macroeconomist. There was a big movement of rethinking of all the old dogma. The phrase rethinking macroeconomics is taken from a series of conferences that Olivier Blanchard organized at the IMF. And I mean, I will not go over the list, but I mean, the old dogma, from capital flows to the impact of reforms, to the importance of public investment, all of that was reassessed, and the old idea that governments should get out of the way was a kind of result. Basically, the cursor between markets and the government moved from very close to market to market primacy, moved a little bit towards the center. And so now most macroeconomists would agree that you need both market forces and government intervention to keep the economy on a more or less stable growth pattern. Okay, and that movement was completely missed by Europe, that stubbornly kept applying the old recipes from the 90s. So when I gave a similar lecture in 2019, this would be my last slide, and I would say, for once, Monet got it wrong. So Europe did not take the global financial crisis and use it to make a leap forward and to try to become more functional, but it actually wasted the crisis and did not take advantage of it to try to improve its working and its policies. Okay. Then came COVID, and this is just a summary of what I said. Then came COVID. COVID was an atypical crisis, I don't have to tell you. It was a crisis that hit both the demand side and the supply side of the economy. There was a challenge that was clear from the very beginning, that while the economy was artificially closed, it should be kept alive. And so it should be avoided that firms go bankrupt. It should be avoided that incomes fall too much, wages and other types of income, and that unemployment increase too much. And so fiscal policies, national fiscal policies, jointly, each in isolation, did that. So the fiscal effort that was massive, I will have a couple of figures in the next slide, was meant to try to provide firms with enough liquidity. So there were lots of guarantees, loans, deferral of payments, subsidies, etc., etc. Most countries implemented job retention schemes to avoid that firms fired workers, and so they basically paid wages on behalf of firms, and of course they spent money to try to keep the healthcare system from collapsing under the pressure of the pandemics. And of course that was not for free. As you can see, the primary balance went into very strong deficit, and this very strong deficit actually went into 2021. So we are still, for 2 years, European countries and all the economies in the world actually needed to support the economy. Mostly that was done because of the features of the European countries. Mostly that was done through automatic stabilization. This is the yellow bar. The yellow part of these bars is the cyclical component of net lending. And of course, I will not go into details. I'm running a little bit late. That also led to that was the feature of this support was on the support for labor markets. So this is a new thing that happened in 2020 with respect to the old crisis. Instead of paying unemployment benefits to workers fired by firms, government decided to implement these job retention schemes and to pay the wage on behalf of the firm, but not have workers fired, which of course was a very clever thing to do, because if you preserve the working relationship, once the economy would start growing again, this working relationship, which is much more than just simply paying a wage, it's a set of intangible relationship between the worker and the firm, it would be preserved, and so the recovery would be faster. And these are taken from an IMF fiscal monitor, the spring 2021 fiscal monitor, and you can read the chapter. It's quite interesting, and it shows how, in fact, the categories that were most protected were the weakest categories. So the youngsters and the women, that usually are the first one to actually suffer from tensions in the labor market, and in that case they were preserved. The dam was successful. It was very costly, but also quite successful. This is just to show you, this is the Eurozone as a whole. As you can see, GDP, so economic activity, dropped significantly, but incomes dropped much less because they were paid by the government, basically, and employment dropped even less. So the objective of preserving the economy while it was not producing was overall attained, and this is one of the reasons why of the strong rebound. Very quick side note, everything I'm saying seems very nice, but you should not forget that this is taken from a rich country perspective. So in advanced economies, that massive effort was done, but in the emerging economies and in the low-income economies, the fiscal space was much more reduced, and so the capacity of government to contrast the recession was much lower. If the EU was not in the first line, because in Europe we have national fiscal policies, it doesn't mean that it didn't do anything. So first of all, in the first phase, in the emergency phase, what the EU did was to act as a facilitator, so to help to shield countries while they were doing that effort. And so on one side, the ECB injected a massive amount of liquidity in the system, first through the support to the banking sector that was targeted to ongoing financing of small and medium enterprises. Basically, the idea was we give you money for free or even at negative rates, so we subsidize you to borrow from us, but you have to transfer this money to small and medium enterprise, so you have to keep the credit flows to the firm sector alive. And then the very famous pandemic emergency purchase program, the PEP, which was open until last week, until March 31st. It was a massive program of purchase of public bonds that was, on top of being massive, also quite innovative, because for the first time the ECB allowed itself to buy bonds according to the needs of the countries and not following what we call the capital key, so the quota given by the capital of countries in the share of countries in the capital of the ECB. Okay, the ECB injected liquidity, and the Commission also was quite important. They got out of the way in some sense. So first of all, they suspended the Stability Pact. It's still suspended until the end of 2022, and then they softened state aid rules so that countries could help sector without being, or firms, or specific firms, without being accused of biasing free competition. And the second thing the Commission did was to put in place financial assistance. So basically, they, through a number of different programs, from the new SURE mechanisms to support labor markets, to the COVID line for healthcare related expenditure that ended up being a flop, didn't work at all, to the EIB providing credit to firms, the principle was always the same. The Commission or these funds would borrow at very low rates because of the credit ratings of the Commission, and then would pass these very low rates to countries by lending them money. And SURE, in particular, was quite successful. It basically exhausted its its lending capacity of 100 billion. 19 countries, 19 European countries, sorry, used it to finance their expenditure. That was the emergency. Going forward, this is also something quite remarkable that made previously very negative and pessimistic people like me regain a little bit of hope. While reacting to the emergency, the Commission was surprisingly forward-looking. They started immediately thinking to the next step. So what will happen once the pandemic is over? And of course, the challenges of the second phase, of the post-pandemic phase, were challenges that no European country could actually work on alone. Restarting growth in a sustainable way, trying to use the crisis as an opportunity to fast track and to boost the transition to sustainable growth, and of course, try to find a way to manage this huge debt legacy that we were left with. And all of these tasks are well beyond even the largest European, the strongest European country's capacity, and so the European dimension became really central into this. And what is quite surprising is that the Commission, in just a matter of weeks, the proposal of the Commission is dated of May 27th, 2020, so just some countries, for example, my adoptive country, France, was not even out of lockdown yet. The Commission came out with the Next Generation EU proposition, which has lots of flaws, but it really is a qualitative change in the way Europe manages its growth. And so the Next Generation EU program, I don't have to waste your time on that, you probably know about it. It's a large borrowing program of around 750 billions that is then distributed through grants and loans to the European country based not so much on their size, but based on their needs. And so there is some sort of debt material. We all borrow, and then we give this money to those who need it more. And so there is, for the first time, debt mutualization that Germany, up to that point, had always refused. And at that point, not only didn't refuse it, but actually Germany was the engine behind the proposal of Next Generation EU. Within Next Generation EU, the most important program is the so-called Recovery Fund, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, and it's basically, as you can see, 670 billion out of the 750, and the idea is really that this money needs to be spent into very specific items. There are quotas, so 37% needs to go to the ecological transition, 20% needs to go to digitalization, and that was a way, in my opinion, very clever way to impose conditions that would make the plans that remains national. It's governments that spend, it's not the Commission, but these plans, so each government spends in isolation, but because of these conditions, their spending plans eventually become a coherent and consistent spending plan that is consistent with the work program of the von der Leyen Commission that had been outlined just a few months before the pandemics started. Many say that the Next Generation EU is the beginning of a federal Europe. Well, no, it is not. It is not because it is temporary, because it is limited, and because it is true that we borrow together, but as I just said, we don't spend together. And so it remains quite different from what we had in 1792, when Hamilton decided to absorb the debt of the American states and to create, if you want, the federal treasury. Okay. Fiscal policy is the new or old, you can say, if you think of Keynes, kid in town in this phase. It is there to support the economy, we just saw it. It is there to support long-term growth. It is there to implement industrial policy. So I would say that the debate on the thinking economics that had been on which it has that had been kept outside of Europe until 2020 is now finally made it into the European policy quarters. I am very much involved in the European debate, including with European institutions, European policy makers, and it is quite astonishing how the tone has changed now in Europe with respect to just a couple of years ago. And that makes the Maastricht institutions really relics from a previous age. Okay, so the lessons of the crisis for the EU reform are twofold. First, we can see that if we don't have macroeconomic policies, the single currency cannot function. The idea that markets can absorb all shocks proved first in 2008, then in 2010, and then again in 2020 completely wrong. It is quite clear that we need to find a way to implement active macroeconomic policies to keep the single currency viable. Second lesson, there are no symmetrical shocks. Even a shock that hits everybody will not hit everybody in the same way. Italy suffered from the COVID crisis much more than France or than Germany. Third, the common response to shocks is much more efficient. We could see that the fact that we had financial assistance coming from Europe and protection coming from Europe is what allowed national countries to work. And more important, probably for the future, is that if you frame it in a good way, in a proper way, solidarity can actually be part of the package. It is not true that mutualization of debt of resources can never happen. It can happen as long as you manage to frame it in a decent way. The second premise is that the European construction is really something that is completely outdated. On paper, we have what you see there, which I described, and in practice, we took away everything we had on paper. We had massive intervention, we had monetary policy that was very much proactive, and we clearly are in a phase in which we think that industrial policy and public investment are very important in ensuring long-term growth and the transition to a more sustainable economy. And so we need to realign these two things, what we are in practice, what we did in practice, and what we are on paper, and that is the whole debate on the Eurozone reform. Let me skip the next couple of slides. I mean, just to tell you that today public investment is at the center of all the policy debates that we're having in Europe. It has taken a big hit during the consolidation, during the austerity phase, in which it was mostly through the reduction of investment that countries implemented fiscal consolidation. Now it's at the center of the stage. This is a commercial for two outlooks on public investment that I have published, one in 2020, one in 2021, and now we're working on the 2022 edition that will be devoted to the green transition. I allow myself to advertise these things because they are open book and they're open access, so I don't make any money, and it's I'm not using this Tribune for private profit. And so I just encourage you to read it. We have 30 contributors per outlook, and if you're interested in public investment, it's not because I edited it, but many of these chapters are very, very interesting and readings, and very much up to date on the needs of Europe. So, and then don't make any money out of it. So I repeat, so you can do whatever you can read. Industrial policy has come at the center of the stage, and industrial policy is not just European champions, big monopolies. It is a multidimensional policy. Industrial policy is today seen and understood as, for example, the use of taxation, the use of incentives, the use of regulation, the use of monetary policy, the idea that you can finance, for example, green, you can tilt monetary policy towards buying green bonds, or at least non-brown bonds. It's of course the regional cohesion policies that in countries as unequal as Italy, for example, but also the UK, are quite crucial in ensuring a convergence, etc., etc., etc. So the new doctrine on industrial policy is that we should not simply ensure free competition, of course, and we should not only build big national companies like the European champions, Alstom, Siemens, etc., etc. We need to intervene on a number of different dimensions to avoid, to reduce rents as much as possible and to channel resources in the sectors that are more important for future growth. And of course, these we will need for this type of policies, investment, industrial policy, we will need to have some fiscal. I'm running late, and so I'm trying to close in 2-3 minutes, I promise. I apologize. We need to actually find a way to create room for fiscal policy to implement all the things they say, investment, industrial policy, etc., etc. And that can, in principle, happen in 2 different ways. We could keep governments incapable of spending and constrained by rules as we have now. At that point, we need to have some fiscal capacity at the center. So the capacity to implement industrial policy, to channel resources into public investment can come from a new fiscal capacity at the center, like the United States, where you have strong constraints on fiscal policy of the states, but you have an unconstrained federal budget. Or you could keep fiscal policy at the national level, but then, of course, you need to reform radically the rules in order to give countries the fiscal space. So we can go either way, or we can have a mix of the two, but in one way or another, we need to create this fiscal space for the challenges of the next few years. Okay. The debate on the rules is quite interesting. The Stability Pact that a few of us criticized since the very beginning, since the early year 2000, now everybody says it didn't work. I could say you should have read my papers, and not only mine, of course, the papers of a number of us in 2002, 2003. We already said what is now common knowledge. They are procyclical, they are the bias against investment, as I said before. They have become so complex that basically now no country is ever sanctioned, etc., etc. So there is a consultation by the Commission that actually started before the pandemics on reforming the fiscal rule. That I will skip that. That debate is meant to lead to a proposal of the Commission immediately after the summer. So in the next fall, the Commission will make a proposal on how to reform the rules. The probably the let me go directly there. The possible outcome of such a consultation process could be a sort of green golden rule. So the Commission would argue that if countries spend on green transition, on the ecological transition, they can spend using that. They do not need to balance their budget regarding that. That would be a very good first step. It would be a way to acknowledge that capital is important and investment is important. My fear is that if we stop to that, to just saving, if you want, green investment, that would not be enough from a quantitative point of view. And so probably we should give more attention to the creation of central fiscal capacity. Lots of people are saying that if the Next Generation EU works well, that could be the blueprint for a permanent Next Generation EU. If you want, there are lots of European public goods on which it would make sense to spend at the central level, and of course, a number of issues would raise. How would we raise resources? How much can we, for example, tax multinationals in order to do that? I think the issue of taxing firms is going to be central in the debate of the next few years. If we manage to find ways to avoid tax elusion, of course, we can build some capacity to spend because we can finance that. And then, of course, who will choose what to do with this common expenditure? And so there will be a problem of to solve. That will be the problem of democratic accountability. Last but not least, the legacy of debt. This is just showing how debt has increased between 2019 and 2020 compared to 2008, 2009. As you can see, even that crisis in which we had a huge increase in debt pales with respect to what happened right now. You know, for example, that my own country, Italy, has now 150% of debt. This is per se not quite a large problem, and this is something we should keep in mind. The sustainability of public debt is today not an issue in spite of record high levels of debt. Why? Because we have been for many years in a situation of chronic excess savings, so of an excess of the growth rate over the interest rate that has been, as you can see, on a downward road trend for many years now. And so the objective should be to focus on just the capacity to repay debt, to service debt, not to repaying it, okay? Because the states are being perpetual, they can roll over debt forever. That said, we still have a problem of individual countries being subject to pressure and to potentially become insolvent. So even if it's not a problem globally, the issue of debt needs to be addressed because individual countries might actually be in trouble and may be under pressure from markets. Okay, one first option that is being quite discussed here in Europe is, okay, let's keep this debt into the belly of the ECB. The ECB has bought a lot of debt. Why don't we imagine that it keeps rolling over forever, and so it never shrinks the size of its balance sheet? This is a possible option. People who say that this will create inflation are, in my opinion, wrong. Those who say that this will mean that the ECB becomes dependent of the fiscal authorities are, in my opinion, wrong, because the ECB can do it in a proper way without losing any independence. On the other hand, if the ECB has such a large balance sheet, it might not be able to actually perform its core business. For example, closing the output gap, for example, closing the inflation gap. You can see that tension already now. The ECB is considering whether to restrict a little bit its monetary policy in order to fight inflation. I don't think that would be a good idea, but regardless of whether this is a good or a bad idea, you can see that the ECB now is constrained because they cannot be as restrictive as they would like to be, because if they do that, the interest rate will increase, and of course that will create problems. So the idea of unloading the ECB from the stock of debt it has in its belly might make it easier for the ECB to actually focus on its main objectives. And so the idea that we have been pushing with a few colleagues is that we need to actually, and maybe I will leave that for the discussion, otherwise I will eat all of the discussion, is that we could create a European debt agency, and that European debt agency would manage debt at the European level without necessarily having mutualization and so on and so on and so forth. These are the things that core European countries do not want, okay? And the way to do it would be, it's quite technical. I mean, if you're interested, I can suggest you some readings. The idea would be that this agency basically eventually takes over all of the debt and keeps financing countries with perpetual loans, and the interest rate on these perpetual loans is adapted to the fundamental risk. So countries will remain accountable for their public finances, because if they are irresponsible, the interest rate that the agency asks will increase, and so there will be no debt mutualization, there will be no risk sharing, in spite of a common management of the debt, and that might make the proposal, our proposal, palatable and politically palatable to Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, and so on and so forth, and politically viable. I think I will stop here because I really took too much of your time. Let me stop the sharing and apologize.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
I went for 1 hour, and I'm sorry.
Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. Thanks a lot for the presentation, for a very thought-provoking presentation. And now we can start the Q&A. Thanks a lot, Francesco.